The Ideal of Human Unity, Chapter 32, Internationalism. The idea of humanity as a single race of beings with a common life and a common general interest is among the most characteristic and significant products of modern thought. It is an outcome of the European mind, which proceeds characteristically from life experience to the idea and, without going deeper, returns from the idea upon life in an attempt to change its outward forms and institutions, its order and system. In the European mentality, it has taken the shape known currently as internationalism. Internationalism is the attempt of the human mind and life to grow out of the national idea and form, and even in a way to destroy it, in the interest of the larger synthesis of mankind. An idea proceeding on these lines needs always to attach itself to some actual force or developing power in the life of the times before it can exercise a practical effect. But usually it suffers by contact with the interests and prepossessions of its grosser ally, some lesser or greater diminution of itself, or even a distortion, and in that form, no longer pure and absolute, enters on the first stage of practice. The idea of internationalism was born of the thought of the 18th century, and it took some kind of voice in the first idealistic stages of the French Revolution. But at that time, it was rather a vague intellectual sentiment than a clear idea seeing its way to practice. It found no strong force in life to help it to take visible body. What came out of the French Revolution and the struggle that grew around it was a complete and self-conscious nationalism, and not internationalism. During the 19th century, we see the larger idea growing again in the minds of thinkers, sometimes in a modified form, sometimes in its own pure idealism, till, allying itself with the growing forces of socialism and anarchism, it took a clear body and a recognizable vital force. In its absolute form, it became the internationalism of the intellectuals. Intolerant of nationalism as a narrow spirit of the past, contemptuous of patriotism as an irrational prejudice, a maleficent corporate egoism, characteristic of narrow intellects, and creative of arrogance, prejudice, hatred, oppression, division, and strife between nation and nation, a gross survival of the past, which the growth of reason was destined to destroy. It is founded on a view of things which looks at man in his manhood only, and casts away all those physical and social accidents of birth, rank, class, color, creed, nationality, which have been erected into so many walls and screens, behind which man has hidden himself from his fellow man. He has turned them into sympathy-proof shelters and trenches from which he wages against him a war of defense and aggression war of nations, war of continents, war of classes, war of color with color, creed with creed, culture with culture. All this barbarism, the idea of the intellectual internationalist seeks to abolish by putting man face to face with man on the basis of their common human sympathy, aims, and highest interests of the future. It is entirely futurist in its view. It turns away from the confused and darkened good of the past to the purer good of the future, when man, at last beginning to become a truly intelligent and ethical being, will shake away from him all these sources of prejudice and passion and evil. Humanity will become one in idea and feeling, and life be consciously what it now is in spite of itself, one in its status on earth and its destiny. The height and nobility of the idea is not to be questioned, and certainly a mankind which sets its life upon this basis would make a better, purer, more peaceful and enlightened race than anything we can hope to have at present. But as the human being is now made, the pure idea, though always a great power, is also afflicted by a great weakness. It has an eventual capacity, once born, of taking hold of the rest of the human being and forcing him in the end to acknowledge its truth and make some kind of attempt to embody it. That is its strength. But also because man at present lives more in the outward than in the inward, is governed principally by his vital existence, sensations, feelings, and customary mentality, rather than by his higher thought mind, and feels himself in these to be really alive, really to exist and be, while the world of ideas is to him something remote and abstract and, however powerful and interesting in its way, not a living thing. The pure idea seems, until it is embodied in life, something not quite real. In that abstractness and remoteness lies its weakness. The sense of this abstractness imposes on the idea an undue haste to get itself recognized by life and embodied in a form. If it could have confidence in its strength and be content to grow, to insist, to impress itself till it got well into the spirit of man, it might conceivably become a real part of his soul life, a permanent power in his psychology, and might succeed in remolding his whole life in its image. But it has inevitably a desire to get as soon as possible admitted into a form of the life, for until then it does not feel itself strong, and cannot quite be sure that it has vindicated its truth. It hurries into action before it has real knowledge of itself, and thereby prepares its own disappointment, even when it seems to triumph and fulfill its object. For in order to succeed, it allies itself with powers and movements which are impelled by another aim than its own, but are glad enough to get its aid so that they may strengthen their own case and claim. Thus, when it realizes itself at last, it does it in a mixed, impure, and ineffective form. Life accepts it as a partial habit, but not completely, not quite sincerely. That has been the history of every idea in succession, and one reason at least why there is almost always something unreal, inconclusive, and tormented about human progress. There are many conditions and tendencies in human life at present which are favorable to the progress of the internationalist idea. The strongest of these favorable forces is the constant drawing closer of the knots of international life, the multiplication of points of contact and threads of communication, and an increasing community in thought, in science, and in knowledge. Science, especially, has been a great force in this direction, for science is a thing common to all men in its conclusions, open to all in its methods, available to all in its results. It is international in its very nature. There can be no such thing as a national science, but only the nation's contributions to the work and growth of science, which are the indivisible inheritance of all humanity. Therefore, it is easier for men of science, or those strongly influenced by science, to grow into the international spirit. And all the world is now beginning to feel the scientific influence and to live in it. Science also has created that closer contact of every part of the world with every other part, out of which some sort of international mind is growing. Even cosmopolitan habits of life are now not uncommon, and there are a fair number of persons who are as much or more citizens of the world as citizens of their own nation. The growth of knowledge is interesting the peoples in each other's art, culture, religion, ideas, and is breaking down at many points the prejudice, arrogance, and exclusiveness of the old nationalistic sentiment. Religion, which ought to have led the way, but owing to its greater dependence on its external parts and its infrarational rather than its spiritual impulses, has been as much, or even more, a sower of discord as a teacher of unity. Religion is beginning to realize, a little dimly and ineffectively as yet, that spirituality is, after all, its own chief business and true aim, and that it is also the common element and the common bond of all religions. As these influences grow and come more and more consciously to cooperate with each other, it might be hoped that the necessary psychological modification will quietly, gradually, but still irresistibly, and at last, with an increasing force of rapidity, take place, which can prepare a real and fundamental change in the life of humanity. But this is, at present, a slow process. And meanwhile, the internationalist idea, eager for effectuation, allied and almost identified itself with two increasingly powerful movements, which have both assumed an international character, socialism and anarchism. Indeed, it is this alliance that most commonly went by the name of internationalism. But this socialistic and anarchistic internationalism was recently put to the test, the fiery test of the European War, and thus tried, it was found sadly wanting. In every country, the Socialist Party shed its internationalist promise with the greatest ease and lightness. German socialism, the protagonist of the idea, massively leading the way in this formidable abjuration. It is true that a small minority in each country either remained heroically faithful to its principles or soon returned to them, and as the general weariness of the great international massacre grew, even the majority showed a sensible turn in the same direction. But this was rather the fruit of circumstance than of principle. Russian socialism, it may be said, has, at least in its extremer form, shown a stronger root of internationalistic feeling. But what it has actually attempted to accomplish is a development of labor rule on the basis of a purified nationalism, non-aggressive except for the revolutionary purposes, and self-contained, and not on the larger international idea. In any case, the actual results of the Russian attempt show only, up to the present, a failure of the idea to acquire the vital strength and efficiency which would justify it to life. It is possible to use them much more as a telling argument against internationalism than a justification of its truth, or at least of its applicability in the present stage of human progress. But what is the cause of this almost total bankruptcy of the international ideal under the strong test of life? Partly it may be because the triumph of socialism is not necessarily bound up with the progress of internationalism. Socialism is really an attempt to complete the growth of the national community by making the individual do what he has never yet done, live for the community more than for himself. It is an outgrowth of the national, not of the international idea. No doubt, when the society of the nation has been perfected, the society of nations can and even must be formed. But this is a later possible or eventual result of socialism, not its primary vital necessity. In the crises of life, it is the primary vital necessity which tells, while the other and remoter element betrays itself to be a mere idea, not yet ready for accomplishment. It can only become powerful when it also becomes either a vital or a psychological necessity. The real truth, the real cause of the failure, is that internationalism is, as yet, except with some exceptional men, merely an idea. It is not yet a thing near to our vital feelings, or otherwise a part of our psychology. The normal socialist or syndicalist cannot escape from the general human feeling, and in the test, he too turns out, even though he were a professed sans-patrie in ordinary times, in his inner heart and being a nationalist. As a vital fact, moreover, these movements have been a revolt of labor, aided by a number of intellectuals against the established state of things, and they have only allied themselves with internationalism because that too is an intellectual revolt, and because its idea helps them in the battle. If labor comes to power, will it keep or shed its internationalistic tendencies? The experience of countries in which it is or has been at the head of affairs does not give an encouraging answer, and it may at least be said that, unless at the time the psychological change in humanity has gone much farther than it has now, labor in power is likely to shed more of the internationalist feeling than it will succeed in keeping, and to act very much from the old human motives. No doubt, the European war itself was an explosion of all that was dangerous and evil in successful nationalism, and the resulting conflagration may well turn out to have been a purificatory process that has burned up many things that needed to die. It has already strengthened the international idea and forced it on governments and peoples. But we cannot rely too greatly on ideas and resolutions formed in a moment of abnormal crisis, under the violent stress of exceptional circumstances. Some effect there may be in the end, some first recognition of juster principles in international dealings, some attempt at a better, more rational, or at least a more convenient international order. But until the idea of humanity has grown not only upon the intelligence, but in the sentiments, feelings, natural sympathies, and mental habits of man, the progress made is likely to be more in external adjustments than in vital matters, more in a use of the ideal for mixed and egoistic purposes, than at once or soon in a large and sincere realization of the ideal. Until a man in his heart is ready, a profound change of the world conditions cannot come. Or it can only be brought about by force, physical force, or else force of circumstances, and that leaves all the real work to be done. A frame may have then been made, but the soul will have still to grow into that mechanical body.